Bonjour à toutes, bonjour à tous.
Hello, everybody. My name is Delphine Yaga, and I'm delighted on behalf of SwissAid to welcome you, so many of you, to this third webinar in the Build Back Better Food System series. Last March, we started this project by addressing the topic of agroecology in the face of climate change. In May, we focused on the link between biodiversity erosion and its consequences on agricultural and food systems. Today, we will focus on local markets. Sometimes described as informal, these markets play a vital role since they supply millions of people around the world, particularly in rural areas of southern countries. What are their strengths and limitations? How were they supplied during the pandemic and the restrictions on movement that were put in place? We will try to answer these questions thanks to the explications of Dimanda Merci Memondine, SwissAid's program manager for the strengthening of civil society in Chad. A speech from the field, which will then be enriched by that of Matthias Bistwanger, Professor of Economics at the University of Applied Sciences in Olten, who will take a look at the international markets. The situation is complex. In front of the local markets on a human scale that were so highly praised during the pandemic, there are giants, players in the global food trade who put a lot of pressure on small markets. Exports, imports, free trade, and protectionism will be among the issues addressed in these presentations. And who says large marches and markets and exports generally says intensive monoculture. Dr. Dino Martins, biologist and director of the Mpala Research Center in Kenya, will take a few moments to explain the important link between local markets and biodiversity preservation. With the UN Summit on Food System in New York just 1 month away, the role of local markets and food systems is particularly topical. It is well known that hunger has been gaining ground in the world for the last 10 years and that the situation is worsening due to the pandemic. The picture is bleak. The State of Food Security Report 2021 indicates that 9.9% of the population was undernourished in 2020 compared to 8.4% in 2019. About 810 million people faced hunger last year. In order to achieve the number 2 goal of the United Nations 2030 agenda to eradicate hunger, there is an urgent need to change our food systems in a profound way. Agroecology is undoubtedly one of the paths to follow. To discuss the topic, we are lucky to have 3 speakers that I mentioned earlier, and then you will have the opportunity to speak as well. As in previous webinars, Andrea Kuchara, a journalist from the political section of the NZZ am Sonntag, will moderate the discussion. I would like to hand over to her for a more detailed presentation of the speakers, the course of the webinar, and some technical information. I would like to thank you for your participating and wish you an excellent webinar. Thank you very much, and a very warm welcome from my side as well. Before introducing our 3 speakers to you, I would like to mention 4 technical points. First of all, I would like to ask you, if you haven't done so yet, you need to choose a language. You will find a button with the globe on the bottom of the scale. You can choose between English, French, and German. It is very important to make that choice in order to be able to speak the language you wish to speak and in order to make the translation possible. So please do not change the language throughout the webinar. Second point, we really encourage you to participate actively at the end of each presentation. You will have the opportunity to ask questions. Do not hesitate to do so. And after the 3 presentations, we will have an open discussion where you also have the possibility for all of you to share in that discussion. In order to do so, you need to choose the button, raise your hand, then we free the access for you, and then you can speak and everybody will be able to hear you. Third point, as you might have seen already, there is a chat. It will be active only in the first part of the webinar. If you have technical problems, for example, you can write them in the chat and then we will help you. In the second part of the webinar, the chat will no longer be active and we will then have an oral discussion. The webinar will be registered. You may have seen that in the beginning. However, you will only appear if you want to participate. Otherwise, you can just stay passive. Obviously, we do not hope so because we really encourage active participation. Now, I have the great pleasure, to introduce our first speaker to you, our responsible for the program in charge of Swiss Aid. Unfortunately, we are not able to hear her, but we will be able to hear her presentation. Ms. Marin Hucin had a scholarship of the French embassy, which took her to Lyon, where she studied local market. She was also working for Oxfam and the UN before coming to Swiss Aid in 2019. She will talk about the influence of the COVID pandemic on local markets in Chad, where the markets face huge problems today. She will also tell us a little bit about what we can do in that situation, and she will point out that women play a key role in that area. Please. Thank you very much, Andrea, and welcome everybody. It is a pleasure to speak to you this morning, to speak about markets and food security. I will give you a few examples from Chad. Chad is a landlocked country in Central Africa with superficies of with about 15 million inhabitants, and in 2020, Chad was the 187th of 189th countries in terms of the Human Development Index. And today, a large part of the society in Chad live below the poverty line, especially in rural areas where the population primarily lives from agriculture. Chad has an office for food security, which has the mandate to buy cereal, and especially in difficult times. And all that has become more difficult. From June to August, producers usually carry out other works waiting for harvest. But unfortunately, the situation gets worse and worse in Chad. We have about 15 million inhabitants, and a large part of them is mal or undernourished. 8.9% of adult women over 18 and 3.1% of adult men live with obesity. The food systems, which are the most used in the households, is the traditional family agriculture, and amongst the most consumed foods, we have corn, for example, and other dried cereal. Households spend up to 70% of their income on food. The system is very fragile, and those households have great difficulties to raise money for other dispenses than foods, like, for example, education, housing, etc. Women are essential in all areas of agriculture. They are responsible for the harvest, and they are responsible to meet the needs of their families and their families, the well-being in general. They are very important also in the area of other agricultural areas. And very often, women have difficulties to have access to loans, for example, but also to schooling and to education. They are very important for food security, but their role is much underestimated. And it's not sufficient today because they are very important in the area of agriculture. During the COVID-19 crisis, the households tried to find strategies. For example, they wanted to buy more food products and to have more nutrient dense food products, for example. Usually the family eats 3 times a day, but during the COVID pandemics, this would reduce to 1 meal per day only. And there are also social cultural practices which worsen still the situation of those families. For example, the women and girls were particularly malnourished. For example, a household would at normal times buy 2 chicken, and during COVID it would be much less. So the women, the men and the boys eat first, and the girls and women would only eat vegetables, for example. All this obviously has repercussions also on the income of those poor families, especially in rural zones. There are um, markets which do not function during the crisis. In Chad, we have 3 different types of markets. We have the village markets or the farmers markets. The farmers markets, they are situated in villages with less population, and the producers exchange goods amongst themselves. Those markets have the advantage that they're accessible throughout the year, and they are the possibility for those farmers and for those producers to raise money to cover the expenses for other things the family might need. Then there are the markets in intermediate sized cities or in suburban areas. They also take place weekly, and there is also some exchange activity. Compared to the farmers market, you can get more money for your products. However, there is also a lot of competition. Throughout the rain season, many times the rural population does not have access to the markets of those intermediate sized cities. Then there are the large markets in the urban centers with many consumers, and the producers can propose their good quality goods, to a middle class urban society and raise money that way. Although the small producers in Africa try to grow food products for their family, this is being increasingly difficult. And they find it very difficult to have enough money for schooling and for other expenses that are much needed. Usually, they get their revenue from selling their produce or from selling animals. This is very difficult in times of crisis. And in times of crisis, the transport infrastructure is lacking and the access to loans is very limited. So the access to markets is one of the factors that is vital for the well-being of the families. Obviously, there are structural problems and there are problems of the infrastructure quality, um, and also transport in general is a problem. There is a lot of corruption, which hinders producers from bringing their products to the market. In Chad, import products make it difficult for locally produced products to be competitive on the markets. This is due to the fact that the locally produced rice is often of a bad quality, and this bad quality again is due to the rice which is produced industrially, and the locally produced rice is may seem to be of less good quality. So imported rice is also cheaper than the locally produced rice, which means that the local producers are in a disadvantage when they want to sell their rice besides the imported rice products. In 2003, Chad tried to invest at least 10% of its resources in agricultural and rural development. We recommend that the FAO and the other development partners help the state to be able to keep up with that commitment. The state of Chad should also try to guarantee equitable access to resources and to services for production. Stereotypes and cultural practices do not help women. Women need to be able to develop their activity, but very often they do not have any access to loans. Women are very often in charge of the family development, so it is very important that they can participate in production as much as men can. Small agricultural producers need to have access to markets, which means that transport to those market centers needs to be improved, and corruption in police, for example, needs to be increased. Women and men who live in those rural areas need more knowledge and more resources in order to produce nutrient dense food products. Producers in rural areas are very often obliged to sell their agricultural products in order to be able to um, have enough to eat for their family. Thank you very much. This brings me to the end of my presentation. It was very fast, but please feel free to ask questions, and I hope we will be able to treat the topic a little more during the discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ms. Memhochin. To resume, it is better to sell products in cities because the prices are higher in times of pandemics. But there was a lockdown in Chad as well. Mobility was reduced. People could no longer go to those market centers and sell their products. There is also competition due to import products, and women cannot be cannot have land for their for themselves. Who has questions? Please. I can see Therese. Please, if you could introduce yourself before asking your question. Therese, please. You need to accept the fact that we liberate your channel. My name is Therese Fukester, and I am very interested in the development of developing countries and the third world. I would like to know, wouldn't it be able to have a trading partner or maybe a region which tries to build a delivery system to bring produce to the markets? Ms. Memhochin, that question was for you. Yes, thank you very much, Therese. There are merchants, maybe not partners, but merchants who do have means of transport and who do give access to those means of transports to others. However, because of the very bad state of the roads, the transport is very expensive and not accessible for many agricultural producers. Only those who have the financial means have that luxury of transporting their produce to the market centers. So the poor people cannot do that. Very often, wouldn't it be possible for a community, for example, to gather and everybody can participate in that kind of transport? Yes, the community can do that. However, here in Chad, the communities do not have a lot of money, and it is therefore very difficult to launch that kind of initiative. That was very interesting input for SwissAid. Yes, I was going to say that it might be good for SwissAid to support something like that. Yeah, maybe we can go a bit more in depth into that during the discussion. We have now another question before we go on to Mr. Binswanger.
Bonjour.
Hello. Hello, my name is Theodore Belem. And I listened to the presentation with a lot of interest. Thank you very much. And I have one question that came to my mind. And I also have a recommendation to make. Talking about agriculture in Chad, there is a report about obesity, and we mentioned that there are many obese people. Is that due to lack of modernization of agriculture? And if I can recommend something, I would say that we must not forget that agricultural products from family enterprises while women cannot engage in production before um, men authorize them to do so. Shouldn't men recognize women's rights to engage in agriculture? Wouldn't that be a good approach? Thank you very much. Thank you, Theodore, for your question. First, we had a question, and then we had a contribution. You asked whether obesity in Chad is due to the bad quality of agricultural products. Did I understand your question right, Theodore?
L'agriculture familiale.
Non, l'obésité n'est pas seulement
No, obesity is not only the consequence of
agricole, familiale.
consuming family produced agricultural food products. However, there are many factors that lead to obesity. For example, excessive consumption of sugar, of products like alcohol, iced water, and other factors that contribute to obesity. So not only the production of local food.
Merci.
Thank you.
Maintenant, pour la seconde question, c'est beaucoup plus
Now, with regard to the second
intéressant,
question,
c'est que au Tchad,
in Chad, women
l'agriculture,
participate in
mais n'ont pas
on
la
all
même mise
levels of
sur les produits
agricultural
agricoles.
production.
Par exemple,
However,
prendre un premier
they
exemple
cannot be in charge of those
c'est la sauce.
products. For example, they cannot go
Il faut
into town
l'autorisation
and
du mari.
sell things. They need the
La femme
authorization
sera aussi
of their
plus
husband to do
travailler pour
so.
avoir ses récoltes que l'homme. Donc, c'est la tradition qui est comme ça.
It is the tradition in
Mais
Chad that wants
nous,
women
au
to
sein
take on that
d'Associated,
role.
nous travaillons beaucoup avec
But
les
we
hommes
from Swiss Aid, we work a lot with
aussi
men
les femmes. Pour que les
in order
femmes
to
soient
help women,
autonomes et qu'ils puissent
to make them more independent
avoir la même mise sur leur
and
production.
give them the
Nous
possibility
travaillons beaucoup
to
sur ça
be
et
in
dans ce
charge of
domaine,
their production.
Suicide intervient.
There are many areas
Aujourd'hui,
where Swiss
la
Aid
tendance est inverse.
intervenes.
Les femmes se plaignent pour
And
son
today we have a
pas
tendency
toutes les
where
chefs de famille et décident
women are
individuelles comment
increasingly
il faut s'organiser pour
in
assurer
charge of the
l'alimentation
families and
familiale.
organize organize the meals and food in a family. Now we go away from Chad and we go to Mr. Binswanger, to Alton. Mr. Binswanger, I did not know that, but the NZS has a rating of economists, and you are one of the most renowned economists in Switzerland on that list. It is a pleasure to have you here today. Mr. Binswanger is a specialist in research on the link between income and happiness. He also knows a lot about agriculture. He's professor at the University of Northwestern Switzerland, and he will now treat the myth that it is a positive thing for developing countries to export their agricultural products. Thank you very much, and a very warm welcome to everybody. I will first of all try to solve my technical problems and share my presentation with you. I hope you can see my presentation now. If this is not the case, please let me know. My presentation has the title More Prosperity Through Free Trade and Agricultural Products, the Situation in Developing Countries. First of all, some background information. The idea that free trade in general is something positive, and well, that is an idea that's 200 years old and goes back to economist David Ricardo in 817, who had the theory of the comparative advantages in economics. Maybe very briefly, what does that mean for Switzerland? I will only very briefly talk about Switzerland. We always need to keep in mind what we can do as an alternative. In Switzerland, we have very high prices in agricultural in general. And on the other hand, the value, the added value in agriculture is very low. A farmer in Switzerland has an added value about 30,000 francs per year, whereas in the pharma industry or in banking, the added value is situated at over 300,000 Swiss francs, so 10 times more. What is the conclusion of that now? Stop agriculture in Switzerland because there is no added value. The few farmers that are still existent in Switzerland should go to the pharma industry or into banking, and for example, import from foreign countries rather than producing in Switzerland, and then we would have more money at our disposal. This means that if Switzerland still has some agriculture, it is due to a decision against added value and against the market, because purely in an economic context, it wouldn't be worth it anymore. However, in Switzerland, there are many good reasons to continue to do agriculture. For example, the supply guarantee for historic reasons. Food security was endangered during the First World War, for example. There was some kind of famine. And therefore, agricultural politics in Switzerland decided that this should not happen anymore. So agriculture needs to be strong. Biodiversity is an argument also, healthy diets, etc. Those are reasons. Multifunctional services in agriculture as well, which are the reasons for which we still have agriculture in Switzerland. However, we often hear that with the agriculture that we are still, in which we are still engaging, we also have restrictions. And those restrictions hinder countries in Africa and other areas in the world from thriving, because they could produce agricultural products to Switzerland and develop in that way. So this brings us already to developing countries. In developing countries, we often hear that a transfer to a modern agriculture would be an important part of economic development. However, what does this mean? This means that production needs to be profoundly changed. We do no longer produce the foods that you need for your own diet, but you produce what we call cash crops, for example, coffee, cacao, tea, cotton, etc. You then export those products, and this way you have many revenues from export, and with those revenues you could then launch the development of the country. And protectionist measures in developing countries, in industrialized countries, would then hinder those countries from thriving in that sense. However, does it really function that way? If we have an agriculture that exports a lot, that means a few products are prioritized, few commodities or products which can be exported on a very large scale. And this means that the entire agricultural system needs to be transformed. We need a highly productive agricultural system which produces the commodities, and the gains from those products depend on the export price. And I will show you later on that those prices are extremely volatile. It also means that production of food products or the local food production is no longer used to feed the local population. And the local population becomes increasingly dependent on food imports. And at the same time, because you produce those cash crops, which are dependent on fertilizers, on pesticides, etc., you become more dependent on the people who buy those products. So first of all, in terms of production, because you need certain articles for the production that you need to import, and then you're dependent again if you want to export those products, because you become dependent from the world market. Let's have a look at the statistics. Food imports and exports of African countries south of the Sahara between 1990 and 2019. If we look at those curves, we see that traditionally most of those countries were food export countries. If you look at the graphics here, you can see that imports increased more rapidly than exports. So part of those countries are today net food import countries. On the one hand, this is due to a very strong demographic evolution. And those countries can today no longer feed their population with what they are producing in their country. Here we have again the same countries, the African countries south of the Sahara since 1960, and here the situation is even more extreme. Exports were constant for a long time, but then imports were extremely low up to the 1960s and then saw a dramatic rise. If we have a closer look at the different countries, you can see that the situation varies. There are countries, certain countries, for which export has been a success, for example, for Ivory Coast or Ghana. This is mostly due to the fact that they concentrated on a commodity, cacao, where the price evolution was positive. For other commodities, the situation is not as good. You can see a series of countries, the countries colored in red, which are the countries who became net food import countries. Let's have a look now at the world market prices. Here, for example, the world market price for coffee per pound. you can see the price fluctuates between 50 cents and around $3. In terms of percentages, that fluctuation is enormous. And the country producing the coffee is completely dependent on the world market prices. So there may be good years, but then there may be very bad years, and the country is increasingly dependent on those prices. Here are the statistics for cacao. The product produced by Ivory Coast, for example, since the year 2000, the development is rather positive. However, as a long-term trend, we can say that the price here is fluctuating as well, and the country will always be dependent on the world market price. Now, what is the situation like for other products that need to be imported by those African countries? There is one important product, wheat. Wheat is primarily produced in Northern America. USA, Canada are huge wheat export countries. They export wheat to Africa, which might seem strange because one could imagine that developing countries produce food products and export them to industrialized countries. But that's not true. America produces wheat on a large scale and exports it to Africa. The same for rice. Rice is produced in Southeast Asia, and the Southeast Asian countries export rice on a large scale and again to African countries. If we look at the world market price for rice, we see that the prices have risen. On the one hand, those countries had very fluctuating prices for some commodities like coffee, for example, but for commodities the African countries import, they had to pay higher prices, which means that their trade balance is negative and the country becomes increasingly dependent on the import of food products. I would like to quote something from a paper of Senegal. Cash crops reduce the welfare of farm households in Senegal. Involving in producing cash crops poses a risk to food insecurity to farm households, as they may find themselves in the end paying more for expensive food for their own consumption while using the opportunity to get higher revenue. That's exactly what I mentioned before. Now, what is the conclusion of all that? There are a few successful examples, like, for example, Ivory Coast or Ghana, but most countries have to face negative consequences of the transfer to cash crops, and they became net food product importers. And the transfer to monocultures obviously also has negative consequences on agroecology. Last slide, as a recommendation, food guarantee, but most of all, food sovereignty should be an important goal of agriculture in developing countries. However, this very often conflicts with what I've just told you, an orientation towards export. And money comes from diversification and from transforming food products. And those countries are not benefiting from that. In general, we can say that measured restrictions on free trade are reasonable because they help to increase prosperity and also agroecology. But only in the 1980s, agricultural products were included in the free trade agreements. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Mr. Binswanger. I would now suggest that as we do not have much time left, you probably have many questions. I myself have a lot of questions. And I would now suggest that we start the discussion with Mr. Dino Martins, who will then have the possibility to describe things from his point of view. And then we'll have the general discussion. Maybe a few words concerning Mr. Martins. He's the director of the Ampala Developing Center. It is a center for research 200 kilometers north of Nairobi in Kenya. So we go back to the African continent. He is also in charge of teaching in Princeton in the US. And he's a biologist. He loves insects, agroecology, very important topic. And obviously there is a link to the topic of insects. And something else Dr. Martins is doing research on is the scale of agricultural structures. He wants to be optimistic today, and I'm really looking forward to listening to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrea. And good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining us. Just in case my internet drops, but hopefully I'll be able to reconnect. I do have a slide. Maybe we can, let me see if I can share it from my screen. I wanted to share with you something from the farmers in the field. I hope everybody can see that. And I'm going to just quickly tell you in a few minutes about 4 different farmers. And it's been very interesting to hear about the situation in Chad and also from Matthias, the global situation, especially related to Africa. So today I just want to share very quickly the link between these 4 different farmers and pastoralists in Kenya and the issue of markets and biodiversity. So I'll start on the left side. We have Muhammad, who's a pastoralist. He keeps livestock. He's from the Rendile community. This is a community that live in the Chalbi Desert, one of the most remote parts of the world. They have very little interaction with the outside world. Traditionally, they live entirely on the herds of camels and with a little bit of trade and a little bit of foraging in that environment, a very harsh environment. The camel is a very interesting species because the herds kept by Muhammad eat many hundreds of different species of plants. They are milked. Most of the consumption from the camel is milk, occasionally a little blood. However, today, for most of the pastoralists in northern Kenya, only about 3 to 5% of their calories are coming from their herds. So there's a big disconnect between this very ancient culture that has been there for many thousands of years and what is actually happening, what people are actually consuming and eating, which is very much driven by the market, the wider economy, even in this remote and extremely isolated part of the world. Next here in the middle is a farmer, Peter. Peter was also my student and he's a farmer. His family grow mangoes. Mangoes are a very popular crop in Kenya and the tropics. And Peter's family grow the mangoes for sale, for export. Now, in addition to growing the mangoes, they also grow a lot of other crops and they have livestock. Mangoes are interesting because on Peter's farm, we found over 1,000 different species of pollinators, insects that are pollinating the mangoes. The mangoes are gathered by brokers. These are people who come from the city. They pay the farmer a price. They transport them in lorries to the capital city, and then they're exported. At the farm, the price is about $1 to $2 per box of mangoes. By the time it reaches the city, it's about $10 per box. And by the time it's exported, it's over 40 to 50. So there's this big driver in terms of the value chain, which changes from the farm to the city, to the urban area, and then outside to export. This creates this very strong incentive to grow for sale, but it also shows you the inequality of it, what the farmer is receiving versus what the market is driving and where the value addition is occurring. Now, in this case, the fruit is not being processed. It is being exported as fresh fruit. The next farmer is Domina. Domina is a farmer in Tanzania, and she's growing a legume, which is the cowpea and pigeon pea. These are very important, very nutritious crops. And Domina is growing this both for the consumption of her family as well as for sale. So even many small-scale farmers will produce for themselves. They will also produce for local sale, and that local sale will often be connected and magnified at a wider market level within the local economy. So we looked at the country statistics which Matthias provided, which is very important data. But one important thing is also the within the country trade. You have between different parts of different countries, hugely different populations, different histories and cultures. And so Domina's farm is very interesting because she's growing a number of staple crops, food crops like maize. You can see some maize, leafy vegetables, and then this legume. The legume is really important because it's the only crop she grows that she can harvest and store throughout the dry season. So her family can obtain nutrition from this crop even when there's no rain and there's nothing to harvest, so she can actually continue feeding herself. Now, if we have a situation like we're having this year where there's been a drought, farmers like Domina are now forced to go from being storers of food to actually purchasers of food, or reliant on food aid. And so that also has a number of market dynamics. In Domina's farm, there's a huge diversity of bees, many hundreds of different bee species that are pollinating this legume. And we've actually found diversity of bees can be higher on farms than in wild areas because there's many different plants growing. Finally, on the right is one of my favorite farmers is Esther. Esther grows coffee, and we were just hearing about coffee. Coffee is very widely grown in Kenya. It's an important export crop. Esther does many things on her land because she's able to export the coffee through a cooperative, and she gets a slightly better price than the average price that most farmers are getting. She's getting up to $6 per kilo for her coffee. What Esther also does is she looks after the land in a very particular way, including through beekeeping, providing habitat for other species. And we find that there's many different hundreds of species that are contributing to the pollination of coffee, but it is driven very much by the fact that she can also steward this land. She can afford to keep parts of it wild. She can invest in things like beekeeping, that's additional income, but it also requires resources. So one of the things that we're finding for biodiversity to work on a farm, farmers also need to be above that poverty line. They need to be able to make decisions that are both good for them and for the biodiversity, but are also not urgent or crises linked decisions. As markets fluctuate, this is becoming harder and harder. And within Kenya, land values in these high value agricultural lands are changing, and farmers have actually been uprooting coffee bushes, even though it is illegal to do so in Kenya, to plant other crops that they feel that they can get a better return on, where it's not as driven by an external market and by a very in unequal system. So these four farmers are, for me, the people who are on the front line, on the cutting edge of what's happening in the world today and the problems that we need to solve. They are all part of the food system. They are connected to it both as producers and as consumers. But the one thing that comes from all these examples is that they don't have as much agency or as much power over these decisions that affect their lives. And if they had a little bit more empowerment, the ability to make these decisions, to be part of that decision-making process, if also we could change the imbalance of power in terms of what's driven by markets, whether local or export, the impact both for the farmer, for livelihoods, and for biodiversity would be huge. And so we really need to think about this as we go forward in terms of how can we fix some of these imbalances which operate both at national and international scales as well as local scales. The last point I'd like to make is in working with these farmers, what has struck me is over time, we are losing the diversity of crops and livestock and cultures and people. And to just give you an example, in 100 years, we've gone from using 100,000 different species of plants in our diet to today, just 3 plants make up 60% of the calories we eat. And if we don't fix the food system, we're all going to be ending up eating the same thing all over the world, which will be, I think, very boring for all of us. So thank you so much for giving me the chance to share with you today.
Ja, herzlichen Dank an alle. Wir haben jetzt einerseits von der Pandemie
Thank you
gehört.
very much to all of you. We were talking about pandemics and the impact on Chad, on the local markets in Chad. Matthias Binswanger was talking on a more global level. We were talking about free trade. So actually the opposite of local markets. And then with Mr. Dino Martins, we went back to the front line, back to the field. We were talking about diversity. Not so much about local markets, but I would suggest now that all those who would like to ask questions, I suppose there are many of you, raise their hand. I will then you can then address one of the speakers, you can make a general comment, you can ask a question. We have about 15 minutes left for the discussion. Who wants to ask a question? Katja Remane. Can you hear me? Thank you very much for those very interesting presentations. I will introduce myself. I'm working in intercultural communication, mediation, and I was living in Mali for a few years. And one thing that struck me is that in Africa, there are many Chinese people there, and they buy agricultural zones on a large scale in order to guarantee their food safety in China. I would like to know how those numbers are integrated into the import-export balance, because we're talking here about foods being produced in Africa, which are not consumed in Africa, and which the African population does not benefit from at all. Mr. Bingswanger. Obviously, those things have not been integrated into statistics because we only see how many goods are transferred across the border, but how much value is actually in there, that's another question. And local production does not always mean that that production is the propriety of the people living in the country. Obviously, we have international enterprises which are present in those countries. The Chinese have a huge influence. And in future, we should absolutely integrate those aspects into our statistics. Thank you very much. Mr. Charles Oleni Bumotsi.
Thank you. Thank you so much. My name is Charles Oluen Malozi. I work with Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa. It's a broad alliance of network of civil society organizations pursuing the cause on agroecology and food sovereignty. I think, thank you so much. This is a very, very, very productive and very insightful meeting. Number of key insights coming through. I have a question for Martin, and then I'll make a comment in a minute, and then I'll end. Martin raised a very important question, which is a big question that we all need to reflect. The question of power dynamics in African agroecology and African farming system. In terms of who make these decisions, when we talk about African becoming, some countries are becoming net importers on food, where are this food coming from? So these are big questions about how do we dismantle the power dynamics, and then we put smallholder farmers to be at the center of the conversations of the transformation we want to see. We undertook some joint research, Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa in partnership with the Agroecological Fund. We took a one-year collaborative research focusing on supporting African agroecological enterprises. We interacted around 180 agroecological entrepreneurs in Africa. Most of the problem they talk about is not different from most of the problem you're sharing. Lack of credits, and lack of access to credit, the issues of poor infrastructure, lack of government support and infrastructure support of this. But when you go deep, you find that the biggest problem underlying all this challenge is the question of power. So until we all know this problem, but we're not ready to deal with the problem. Who define the markets? Who define the prices? Who define what to be imported and what kind of things to be imported and exported? These are the conversations that we need to deal with. So until we put a position and a center where we elevate the power of smallholder farmers, that they're capable of representing themselves and make sure that their voice make a contribution to the kind of food system they need. Because almost we found over 85% of smallholder farmers and agroecological farmers, they are self-financed, they cannot access money, because the investors, they have their own interests. So going forward, we need to create platform for smallholder farmers so that their voices contribute, and also African government need to be pushed. They need to be pushed to the extent that they're able to take leadership and they're able to take responsibility in dealing with the crisis the smallholder farmers are pushing to reverse the whole conversation of the African becoming a food net.
Vielen Dank. Ja, das waren viele Punkte, Biodynamie, Frauenrechte.
We touched upon many aspects here. I would like to ask the following question. How can we allow the smaller farmers to be center stage in the future? Do international trade systems, do international markets propose opportunities for those small farmers, or how could we reach a situation where they have more power? Maybe we can ask that question to all three speakers.
I'll jump in if that's okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. That's a very important question. I think I'd look at it in two ways, because we want to make change. And I think the biggest change is a change of governance. The governance and power structures within the agricultural system. For example, in Kenya, between cooperatives and associations, farmers groups, youth groups, and women's groups, if we can make sure there's a structure for them to interface with the market, and for example, development partners, development agencies could play a role in facilitating developing that governance. The other side of governance, because there's a huge imbalance in power, could come from consumers. And we're starting to see this in certain sectors. For example, with palm oil, the deforestation that is a result of that, and the consumer-driven demand for accountability, transparency, real sustainability. But it has to be an iterative process. It can't just be one-sided. And because things change, markets change and societies change and systems change, it has to be a process that also adapts to that change. So everyone has to be able to continuously give feedback and receive feedback and influence the system. It's a big issue right now because some people say, okay, a solution is to put labels and to certify certain things, organic or fair trade, rainforest friendly, pollinator friendly. But what that does is it tends to be very niche and it also then creates inequalities within the local farming system. So how to address that so that everybody can be part of this is very, very critical. But the question that was raised is one ultimately of governance, which has both within country and beyond country dynamics. Thank you.
Eine Frage der Governance, Herr Binswanger, wie würden Sie das
Question of
einschätzen?
governance, Mr. Binswanger, what would you say? Well, I think, if I'm talking about restricting agricultural free trade, we're not talking about black and white, nothing or everything. I would just say it is important to protect certain products during a certain period of time. The problem of governance, well, that's the same all over agricultural systems. Everywhere we have the situation where we have a lot of small producers and a few big buyers. So the power is on the side of the demand, which means that the margins are being eroded constantly. Agriculture is always kept at an existential minimum because due to that power of demand, for example, in Switzerland, we say, well, for a liter of milk, we are ready to pay 40 cents, but not more. And the producers need to sell their products. That's a global problem. We have it in Switzerland, just as we have it in African countries. And actually, we can only solve this problem by creating a counterpower. For example, associations of producers or by direct marketing of products. Ideally, you produce, but also then transform your products, but that's difficult. And actually, we would need a guarantee for a minimal price for those producers to free themselves from that situation of oppression, because otherwise, obviously, we can think about many different things, but the result will always be the same. It's an old economic law. The power of the market is omnipresent. If the power of the market is on the side of the demand, it always means that the prices will sink.
Ja, vielen Dank. Ich würde
Thank you very much. There are more questions, but I would like to hear Ms. Memhotchen. Mr. Binswanger said we need minimal prices for agricultural producers. In Chad, for example, prices exploded. Food prices exploded, which means that there are other problems in the countries. What do you think about that? Do you think we need a minimum price for food products? Does something like that exist in Chad? Thank you, Andrea. The state usually regularizes prices for food products in Chad. However, it is very difficult to control that because merchants usually do not apply the rules fixed by the state because there are many other factors and it's very difficult to control. However, during the COVID-19 pandemics, there were For example, the borders were closed, there were other measurements, and transport costs for many products were rising. So the price for those products on the market was rising as well. And the state does not have a monopoly in that area. It's very difficult to impose something on the producers. Or we have subsidies, but if products are not subsidized, it is very difficult to fix prices. Did that answer your question?
Doch, vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Möchte jemand von Ihnen, Herr Binswanger oder Dino Martins, reagieren? Sonst würde ich das
Mr. Binswanger, Mr. Martins, would you like to react? Otherwise, we can
Frage oder
treat one last question very briefly. We are talking about a minimum price for the farmers and not the market price. We need to reduce the margins on the market and give a bit more back to the farmers. That's a very interesting point, because I think the longer the export chain or the chain, the higher the margin. Who would like to say a last word? Mr. Bellem. Hello, Andrea. I have one question. One question to Matthias. He was talking about agroecology, which is not so much practiced in the area south of the Sahara. Is it probable that that kind of agriculture is being put into praxis and becomes an advantage for producers and their families? Is that something that happens already in those areas, or how can we make it happen? So that was my question to Matthias, but also to the other speakers. Thank you very much. Yes, obviously, I think we need to do much more in that area. We need to try to look what could be a good agricultural production in a certain region, and to foster that. Obviously, there is no one-fits-all model. For us, for example, the question whether we can use certain pesticides or not, how dangerous is it for people's health, or also the question whether we will generate even more food waste if we do that, and wouldn't that be worse, as if we have a certain quantity of fertilizers or herbicides that we use. We need to have a close look on the definition of agroecology, but obviously it is important to produce locally and something that's in harmony with the local ecosystems. I think we do not have enough time to hear our other speakers. Andrea, if you allow me. One last word before we go back to Swiss Aid Switzerland. I will be very brief. Theodore, I would like to answer your question by saying that agroecology would work very well in the area south of the Sahara. It's something that works very well. We've had a few experiments already, and We helped women, for example, to produce sorghum in an ecological way without applying any fertilizers and pesticides, and it was a huge success. Thank you.
Super. Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much.
Ich sehe, es gibt eigentlich noch mehr Fragen auch.
There are many more
Ich würde auch vorschlagen,
questions as I see.
Fragen
I
haben,
would
dass
say that all those who still have questions, please do not hesitate
das
to
Feld
write
war
them
eingeöffnet von der
uh,
Biomann
in
über Glyphosat,
an email.
lokale
We talked about many things, free handles, free trade, women's rights, agroecology. That's something that's very important to Swiss Aid. And this brings us back to Sonja Czurren for a final word. Thank you very much, Andrea. My name is Sonja Czurren, and in the name of Swiss Aid, I would like to thank all of you for this webinar. This session opened our eyes to a very complex topic. I think what we retain today is that small production, which is very diverse, is an important production for many states, and we can strengthen that kind of production. That kind of production and agroecology can help us to reach sustainable production and more nourishing food products. And we need to do everything we can to foster that development. I would like to thank all participants, Ms. Manda Memontim, Mr. Binswanger, Mr. Martins. You allowed us to have a very interdisciplinary discussion. Ms. Kuchera, thank you very much as well. This is the third webinar in our series, and you have been an excellent moderator throughout those sessions. We had a brilliant exchange with experts, with you, but we also wanted to know what the producers have to say, what the farmers have to say on those huge topics which are part of the World Summit, which will take place in December. We worked together with 6 farmers and small producer in Niger, in Tanzania, in Sri Lanka, also in Guatemala and in Switzerland. And what you told us, where you think we can make real change happen to create a better future for you, but also to have better food products for everybody. All that will be published in a report that we will share with you on the summit on the 23rd of December. I would also seize the occasion to thank all those women who sometimes had very difficult many difficulties to connect with us, who had little time, but who were a huge help for us. We had over 15 hours of interviews with them. And finally, I would also like to thank our partners, the Foundation Mercator Switzerland, Foundation Dreikland, also Adlens Sufosek, which we're part of, as well as AVL Dolmetscher, who always support us financially, but also technically. It is still very important to us what the participants think, and therefore it was our pleasure to have experts here, but also to hear the voice of farmers. Thank you very much. It is very important to us to improve ourselves. So a small detail at the end of our session, we will have a questionnaire about the quality of the webinar, and we would appreciate it very much if you could fill in that form. Thank you very much. In the name of Swiss Aid, again, thank you very much for your participation, and goodbye to the, and I say see you again on the 23rd of December.